When the US joined the war in 1941, their primary light tank was the light tank M3, and whilst the vehicle was acceptable for the time, there was an interest in a new light tank. In January of 1941, the US Army started the light tank T7 program, but by August 6, 1942, this tank had grown in weight and size and was now reclassified as the medium tank M7. With no replacement for the light tank M3 in the works, the T21 Light Tank project was started. With the need for a new light tank, representatives of Ordnance Department and Armoured Force held a conference in Fort Knox on 18th of August 1942, where it was decided that they should use the new medium tank T20 as a basis for the light tank. It would mount the 75mm gun M3 and feature armour capable of holding up against caliber 50 rounds whilst being within a 20-ton limit. It was decided that, if possible, the 75mm gun M3 would be replaced with a 76mm higher velocity gun. It was proposed that it would use the medium tank M7's suspension. Following this conference and additional studies, an Ordnance Committee minute was issued in February 1943 detailing the new light tank. It would have a crew of 5, mount a stabilized 76mm gun, and would have a top speed of 45 miles an hour, about 72 kilometers an hour. However, at this stage, the engine, suspension, and various other aspects were not yet finalized, and its weight had been increased up to 47,000 pounds, or about 21.3 metric tons, or 21 long tons. Final layout drawings were finished in March and submitted. By this time, the weight had been increased to 51,000 pounds, or 23.1 metric tons, or 22.8 long tons, with the new top speed being intended to be about 50 miles an hour, roughly 80 kilometers an hour. There was also a second variant, which existed for a short time, called T21E1. This variant was to come in at about 22 tons, later to be increased to 23, and would have more armour than the normal T21, whilst also being able to manage 50 miles an hour. It seems likely that the T21E1 program was accepted as the new T21, as later sheets state the T21 as having almost the same figures as T21E1. The initial armour for this tank was designed to resist only caliber 50 fire, being 1 1/8 inches, or about 2.85 centimeters, on the hull's front and 1.5 inches, 3.8 centimeters, on the turret face. The hull side and rear armour was 1 inch, about 2.5 centimeters, and 3/4 of an inch, 1.9 centimeters, respectively. The turret's side and rear armour were 1 1/8 inches as well. The hull side and rear armour was 1 inch, or 2.5 centimeters, and 3/4 of an inch, about 1.9 centimeters, respectively. The turret's side and rear armour were 1 1/8 inch, again 2.85 centimeters. At a later point, the armour on T21 increased to be the same armour basis as on the light tank M5. The T21E1 project was to have the same armour as the M5 as well. T21 was to mount the 76mm gun M1E1 or M1E2, the primary difference between these two guns being that one had a tighter rifling twist rate than the other. The rounds used by that gun included the M62 armor-piercing capped and M79 armor-piercing. Additional rounds, including high explosives and white phosphorus, were available. The gun was to have elevation and depression limits of plus 25 and negative 10 degrees respectively, as well as being gyro-stabilized. It also was to mount 2 caliber 30 machine guns, one coaxially to the main gun and another in a bow mount on the hull. While it was initially proposed in August 1942 to use the medium tank M7's vertical volute suspension system, or VVSS, it was later decided to utilize torsion bar suspension instead. The tracks that were intended for use were the 18-inch T49 type. Whilst the exact layout is unknown that T21 would have had, it can be assumed, due to it basically just being a lighter T20, it would have been the same or very similar as that on T20E3. The T20E3 suspension, a torsion bar, and initially 3 return rollers per side. However, later on, 2 additional return rollers were added, bringing the total to 5. An idler wheel was attached to the front wheel to compensate for the slack in the track. The engine for both T21 and T21E1 was to be the Ford GAN, which produced 500 brake horsepower at 2600 RPM. The transmission for both was the same 5-speed manual transmission utilized in the M4A3. The location for the engine and transmission is unknown, but again, due to it being just really a lighter T20, it is likely that it would have been in the same position as on the T20, at the rear of the tank. In March 43, the design and layout were presented at Fort Knox 2 Armoured Force. They came to the realization, from their experience with the M7 medium tank, that the T21's weight would just continue to increase in the future, resulting in another under-armoured medium. They then suggested that the T21 project be terminated, and Ordnance replied in July 43 by killing the project. Up until this point, no mock-up or pilot vehicles had ever been started. The fate of the T21E1 is unknown, but it almost certainly was cancelled along with the T21, if indeed it was even still in development at the time. The design, like many before it, was a good idea on paper, but operational realities and desires soon led to a situation where, like the M7 before it, it was doomed to become too heavy to fulfill the light tank role and too light to fulfill the medium tank role. The discontinuation of the T21 program in March 1943 was met with the start of a new project, T24, which would not be deployed until 1944, which in turn forced the US to continue having to field the light tanks M3 and M5 up until the end of the war, despite their growing inferiority.
That's all for this video. Make sure to like, subscribe and hit that bell button. We'll be releasing new videos on the regular. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram or Reddit. If you use Discord, there's a link to our community server in the description. And if you would like to help us continue to develop and expand, please consider donating on Patreon or PayPal. All of the funds will be used to help us enhance and design new articles and features for you. Until next time, keep us in your sights.